Welcome to the Montessori Method Educational Video Series, Part 2. Here, we will take you step by step through the Montessori curriculum so that you can apply these methods in your own home or classroom. Let's begin our review of the Montessori curriculum as explained by Directress Martha Monahan.
The actual application of Dr. Maria Montessori's educational method is best understood by looking at the curriculum. The curriculum is comprised of 5 major areas: everyday living, sensorial, language, math, and cultural studies. Let's begin by looking at the everyday living curriculum. Dr. Montessori recognized in her work with children in the formative periods of the development of her method that young children had a great need to become independent and to care for themselves. And in order to support them in that process, she developed a series of materials which are known as the everyday living materials. The first area is the area of physical skills, or the control of movement. In this area, she designed materials for the child where they could refine their ability to control their hand, where they could begin to concentrate on a task, and that they could gain that sense of mastery and independence over themselves. The activities in the physical skills are divided into activities that require the child to practice pouring and spooning and scooping, twisting and stringing and lacing. And within each of these sequences, Dr. Montessori recognized that children needed to practice the refinement of their movement. By engaging in that process, the child is developing their ability to concentrate on a task, and they're also refining their ability to control their hand. So that within every sequence of the pouring and the spooning and scooping and squeezing and twisting and stringing and lacing, there is a clear sequence that goes from large to small. And the child is working at first with a whole hand movement where they're using both of their hands, eventually down to one hand, and then eventually working down to very fine motor skills that require just the pincer grasp of the 3 fingers, which will eventually be the writing fingers for the child. So there is a very careful thought and consideration that goes into the sequencing of the everyday living materials. The other areas of the everyday living, besides the physical skills, are the care of the person, care of the environment, and grace and courtesy. In the area of care of the person, you would find activities that call for the child to develop the skills of taking care of themselves. One of the primary materials that are used in this area are the dressing frames. The dressing frames are simple square pieces of wood with fabric coverings which have different types of fastening, so that you have a zipper frame, a buckle frame, a snap frame. And each activity or each skill is isolated by an individual frame, so that a young child would begin with the button frame. There are large buttons on the frame that the child needs to practice unbuttoning and buttoning. And by doing that in an isolated way with the dressing frame, the child perfects the skill and the movement of their hand, and then later they're able to apply that skill to themselves, to dressing themselves, or to helping someone else button their coat. So that Montessori was very careful in the design of her materials to really isolate the skill that she was trying to teach and to help the child to focus on. And the dressing frames are an excellent example of how she isolated the particular skill that the child was learning. Another area of the everyday living curriculum is care of the environment. And Dr. Montessori recognized early on in her work that children take great pride in caring for their environment. And the classroom environment is for many children a place where they spend a good portion of their day, so that we really work with them to instill that respect for that classroom environment, so that the children participate in cleaning up the classroom each day, dusting the shelves, making sure the materials are neat and orderly on the shelf, pushing in the chairs, cleaning off the tables, and caring for the living things that are within the classroom environment, watering the plants, washing the leaves of the plant, and caring for the animals. So there are many extensions to the area of the care of the environment, and many activities that you see the children engaging in a Montessori classroom. The last area of the everyday living area is the area of grace and courtesy. And there are not necessarily any formal materials for this. There's a lot of activities that take place in the group, in the full circle, where the teacher is role modeling with another adult, common graces and courtesy that we hope to instill in the children.
Nathan on the nose, and how do you do today? Good. Hi, Nathan. The sun came out this morning.
To summarize, the everyday curriculum focuses on real-life activities that help the child develop, both physically and emotionally. Now, let's look at the sensorial curriculum.
Dr. Montessori recognized from her work and her observation of children that young children learn primarily through their senses. So she designed a series of educational materials that were designed to isolate particular senses, so that there's a series of materials that help the child to refine their visual sense. There's another set of materials that help the child to refine their auditory sense and their tactile sense and their stereognostic sense there, and so forth. So that each series of materials are designed to really look at and refine each individual sense of the child. In this area of the curriculum that we first begin to see some of the materials that Dr. Montessori designed for the specific purpose of educating the child's senses. These materials are referred to as didactic materials, and that refers to the interchange that takes place between the child and the material. Dr. Montessori designed her material so that a child could be independent in exploring the material and not be dependent on an adult to correct them and to help them to finish that activity. Many of the beginning activities that you would see in the sensorial curriculum are activities that are helping the child to begin to match and to sort and to classify. So that activities for matching would begin with very simple activities where the child was matching objects which are the same. And then they would move to activities where they were finding similarities between things. So that those are considered the preliminary activities for the sensorial area before you get into any of the materials that were actually designed by Dr. Maria Montessori. The knob cylinders, or the cylinder block, is one of the first materials that a young child would encounter in the sensorial curriculum in a Montessori classroom. That Dr. Montessori designed this material with a control of error built into it. And what she meant by a control of error was that it was a mechanism that was built into the material that allowed the child to be independent in exploring and working with that material. So that when a Montessori teacher would present this material to the child, they would give a very simple presentation of removing the cylinders from the block and placing them in a random fashion in front of the block. And the work of the child is to replace all of the cylinders back into the block, into the appropriate holes. So it's a one-to-one correspondence between the hole in the block and the loose cylinder, so that the teacher would simply indicate to the child which cylinder they're looking for. The child would need to visually scan the series of the 10 cylinders, find the appropriate match, and then carefully replace the cylinder back into the block. And as the child was doing this material and exploring the material, they're looking at the cylinders, looking for the correct match. It's really calling for their visual attention. It's calling for them to really be very accurate with their guess as to which cylinder they're placing into which block. If the child does not make a correct placement of the cylinder into the block, there would be one cylinder left over, so that the child would automatically know to repeat the activity. The child would take all of the cylinders back out of the block and then repeat the activity until they had successfully mastered the task. As the child progresses through the sequence of the sensorial materials, the control of error becomes less and less obvious, so that it's not inherent and built into the material, but it becomes part of the child's visual acuity, so that they need to notice that there is a slight variance or difference in the serration of the materials, the way that they have placed the materials into the series of 10. An example of this would be the knobless cylinders. This material correlates exactly in dimension to the first material that we were looking at, the knobbed cylinders. This material has a greater control of error. It's more difficult because they are not placing the cylinders into a fixed block, that these cylinders are loose, and that the activity for the child is to be able to place these 10 cylinders into a graduated series going from the largest to the smallest, and that the control of error for this material is the child's eye. So the child is always looking for the next largest cylinder and then placing it into the series. Once the child has placed the cylinders into the series of 10, then they would visually scan the material. And at that point, they would realize if they had placed a cylinder incorrectly into the series, and then they would self-correct that. If a child did not notice that, the teacher would not correct that. The teacher would make note of that and just recognize that the child hadn't quite gotten to that refinement stage with their visual discrimination yet, but that it would be something that the child would progress towards. Dr. Montessori then designed a series of materials that, again, were designed to help the child to refine their visual acuity, their ability to discriminate likenesses and differences. And one of the materials that you would find in a Montessori classroom to assist the child in discriminating colors are called the color boxes. There are several color boxes within this series of materials, and that it has within it primary and secondary and tertiary colors. So the activity for the child is to find the two tablets that are the same color, so that the teacher would invite the child to the activity, and together they would begin removing tablets and placing them randomly on the rug or the table. So the activity for the child is to find the two tablets that are the same color. So from this, the teacher would then give the child a language lesson on this material, so that the teacher would then provide the child with the names of the colors.
Little lady with orange in your shirt. Yeah. Blue in your shirt.
Dr. Montessori again looked at each individual sense of the child and developed materials which would help them to refine that. In the sensorial area, there are materials for the discrimination of form. She began her work with this area by designing geometric solids. The geometric solids are three-dimensional forms of geometric shapes. These are three of the forms that you would find within this set. Dr. Montessori recognized that the hand played a very important role in the education of a child, that they really needed to handle and manipulate the materials, so that she designed these geometric solids for the child to be able to hold in their hand to feel the actual form of each of the shapes. Once the child had explored the materials in a sensorial manner with their hand, the teacher would then give the child the name of that object. So that we have here a cube, a cone, and a sphere. So the activity for the child is first exploring them, handling them, manipulating them, and getting that very concrete impression of that geometric shape into their hand. And then the teacher would attach the language to that object. The materials within this sequence for the visual discrimination of form would move from a three-dimensional form to a two-dimensional form to a one-dimensional form, so that the child is still recognizing the shape in different dimensions and in different forms. That Dr. Montessori had the goal for her sensorial curriculum was for the child to be able to really refine their ability to observe and to discriminate, to note differences and likenesses, but more importantly, to be able to apply that knowledge and that understanding to their outside world, so that a young child that is experiencing the richness of a sensorial curriculum would then be able to go out into the world and find geometric shapes that are within architectural structures, to be able to really note the colors that are within flowers, and to listen to the sounds of nature, and to really appreciate the world around them. The materials that she designed to help the child to refine their auditory sense, one of the traditional materials are called the sound cylinders. These materials are designed to really attune the child's listening skills, so that she designed 6 different cylinders that have varying amounts of medium in them, so that each cylinder makes a very distinct sound. The activity for the child is to find the 2 cylinders that sound exactly the same, so that the child cannot depend on their visual sense to help them do this, because the cylinders are all exactly the same. The child has to depend on their auditory sense to be able to find the appropriate match, so that the teacher would show the child how to listen carefully, and to try to find the cylinder that is exactly the same sound. Once the child has found the 2 cylinders that are the same, they would just place them off to the side as a pair, and then repeat the activity again, looking for the next 2 matches.
To summarize, the sensorial curriculum develops a child's sensory perception by focusing on discrimination of size, color, form, and sound. You have reached the end of Tape 2. Please Please continue with tape 3.